College alumna. I come from a long line of Mundelein College alumna. My mother and her two sisters, all named O'Callahan, are also graduates of Mundelein. I welcome you on behalf of the Gannon Center and the Mundelein College Alumni Board. The silver lining of not being able to meet together in person means that we have alumni from all over the country zooming in to join us from one coast to the other. So we'll be more alert in the future to making sure that we specify the time zone when we send out our initial invitations. As many of you know, the Gannon Center, named after Sister Ann Ida Gannon, was formed over 25 years ago to continue the legacy of Mundelein College: academic excellence, community leadership, and service. Through the generosity of alumni and friends, we provide scholarships through our 4-year progressive program, sponsor research on women's issues, and promote service to various communities around the world. We host women speakers and support women in leadership and research, providing important internships to our students as well. The Women Leadership Archives, or WLA, was initially formed to hold the records of Mundelein College, but has expanded to become a treasured resource used by scholars, alumni, and others around the world. Today, we are presenting a special program by Emily Reiher, Director of the Gannon Center's Women in Leadership Archives. Emily joined us in January and brings a fresh perspective to the WLA. She received her undergraduate from Loyola and so is a committed Rambler. Most of us have been home for close to 10 weeks, and many have used this opportunity to go through attics, basements, garages, and closets to organize our belongings, or are feeling guilty about not being able to face it. We're delighted to have our own certified archivist here today to help us learn more about how we can preserve and protect our family records. So I present Emily Reiher, who's the director of the Women in Leadership Archives.
Thanks very much. And hello to everyone today who's joining us. Jory, if you could please cue up the first slide. Perfect, thank you. So as we're looking at this first image, I wanted to first express my thanks to the rest of the WLA staff, specifically Laura Burfield, Caroline Lind, and all of our graduate assistants who've been working very hard to make our collections available, especially in these unusual times. Without their assistance and hard work, we wouldn't be able to have images like the one you see before you today on the screen. So a big thanks to all of them for their continued commitment to making the archives available. We're going to be seeing a couple of different archival images today. They all come from the WLA collections and specifically from the Mundelein College collection, so I hope you enjoy. Next slide, please. Hello, this is me again, in case you didn't see my thumbnail picture, so that we're able to follow along with the information that I'm presenting. You're mostly just going to be seeing my slides today, but at least wanted you to be able to see what I look like. So hello once again, and I also wanted to give my general disclaimer that I'm going to be telling things from both a personal and from a professional perspective, so sharing those different experiences. And of course, when it comes to your own objects in history, I encourage you to exercise your own best judgment in what's best for your items and telling your own story. Next slide, please. So before we dive into that too much, I just want to talk a little bit more about the Women in Leadership Archives and what we're about. So we collect and make available permanently valuable records of women and women's organizations which document women's lives, roles, and contributions. And we serve a wide variety of users ranging from students and scholars to the general public. So as you can see, we have photos of our basement archival storage where the majority of our collections are kept, as well as our main reference room. We've been working remotely lately, but we look forward to welcoming you again to our space in the future. Next slide, please. And here, of course, is historic Piper Hall, which was once a part of Mundelein College. So the Women in Leadership Archives was established in 1994. The original purpose was to share the history of Mundelein College. So a lot of our early collections are very Mundelein based. However, as we'll see a little bit later, we've expanded our mission quite a bit and have a lot of different areas of collecting focus. Piper Hall itself has a very storied history, and I could go and, talk about that for the entire half hour, so I will do my best not to get off track. But as many of you probably already know, it was once the Mundelein College Library. And the Women in Leadership Archives is, of course, a part of both the Gannon Center and the University Library System. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about our collecting areas. So as I mentioned, we collect in quite a few different subject areas, including activism and women's issues, athletics, civic and cultural engagement, education, the environment, Mundelein College, public service and politics, science, technology and engineering, social justice, visual performing and fine arts, and lastly, women religious. This information is all available on our website. While we collecting these areas, we collect from both individuals and from organizations. So you will see representation amongst both in our collections. While our main focus is on the Chicago area, we do invite collections from other areas as well, especially Illinois, the Midwest, and we also have some national collections as well. Next slide, please. And since I'm talking about the WLA, I have to mention we have a new project that's about to start. So we are seeking Mundelein College class of 1970 participants. We are going to be doing an interview project this summer and fall called Share Your Story, Student Life at Mundelein. We've conducted some interviews in the past. Those have mostly been focused on faculty and administrators, and we'd really like to do something that focuses on student life and tells a little bit more of that story, especially in light of all the anniversary celebrations occurring. So we'd like to start with the class of 1970 as a pilot project, but if you would like to participate and graduated from a different Mundelein class, you can always reach out to us and we'll let you know when we'll be doing those interviews in the future. All the interviews will be conducted via Zoom, and participants will be able to indicate whether they'd like it to be audio only or audio visual. We'll be sending out a call for participants a little bit later in the week or possibly next week and have more info on our website soon. But if you're excited and just can't wait, you can always reach out to us at our general email address. Next slide, please. Okay, so defining archives. So before we get too into talking about your own personal and family archives, let's actually discuss what they are first. So archives are collections of items that have enduring value. I'll talk about value a little bit more in the next slide. So when we talk about archives as a noun, that could refer to the materials, the division within an organization that manages those materials, the professional discipline, the building itself, et cetera, et cetera. So we use the word archives to mean all these different things. When we talk about archive as a verb, like archiving, that actually doesn't have to do with historic archives. That's actually a computing term that refers to storing data. So when talking about my daily work, I actually don't talk about archiving. There's actually a lot of other components to my work. And then an archivist, of course, is the person responsible for managing those different responsibilities. All of these definitions are abridged from the Society of American Archivists. They have a really wonderful dictionary online as you're preserving your own collections. If you come across some terms that you're not familiar with, I recommend that as a resource. And I do have SAA linked a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So working with an archivist. In a way, I'm kind of starting backwards first here. You would think that working with an archivist might come last, but I've actually put it first. Just because I talk to a lot of donors and a lot of folks who try out the process on their own and are thinking about donating and have tried to do things on their own. And we could have been assisting or helping them a lot sooner. So it's really never too soon to start a conversation and reach out to a potential archives or archivist. So how do you find someone if you think that you have collections that might be of interest? One way to do that is through Archive Grid, which I've linked here. So this is sort of a consortia that shows different archives throughout the United States. You can also do some searching on your favorite search engine to see places that are geographically close to you or thematically have different areas of collecting focus that fit with the type of item or type of collection that you have. So my slide a couple slides ago, talked about the different areas of collecting focus that we have. Most archives are going to have some information like that available on their webpage. So you can decide for yourself if you think you have items that might have a good fit. If you are an alum of Mundelein College or are thinking of donating a collection that fits under one of those other areas of scope, you can always reach out to us at our general email address. If you graduated from Loyola or think you have something in their collecting scope or want to learn more, there is their website to learn more about what they collect. And they are also doing a project now as well remotely, where they are documenting COVID-19 experiences in the Loyola community. So I invite you to look at that as well. And lastly, if you need more information on what types of questions to ask an archivist or how to go about finding one, there's a really great brochure that I've linked here at the bottom that takes you through that kind of step-by-step a little bit more. Next slide, please.
Emily, can I interrupt you one quick second? I just wanted to let everyone know that these slides will be sent out and be available. So if you're madly taking notes, you don't need to. You'll be able to obtain these slides, as Emily said, either later this week or next week.
Yes, thank you so much. So I have included hyperlinks to every website that's mentioned on here. So yes, when you receive them, you'll just be able to click the link. So don't worry too much about trying to write down a specific URL. I'll also have additional resources at the end that are just all URLs. So don't worry too much about that. So determining value. So the main takeaway that I want to talk about is that enduring value is more important than other types of value. So we mentioned enduring value already in talking about what an archivist is and what archives are. A lot of times when we say the word value, I think our minds immediately jump to monetary value, right? Like you're watching Antiques Roadshow or something of that nature. So you're thinking about appraising an item and getting a dollar amount for it. When we talk about archival items, we're really not looking at that monetary value. We're looking more at that research value, that historic value. Is it going to be of interest or of note to people later? And for your own personal archives, I encourage you to really think about that sentimental value. So what is unique? What is special to you or your family? And what tells the story of you or your family? So archival items are often unique and one of a kind. And something doesn't have to be a certain age to be archival. Again, when we talk about value, I think sometimes there's this assumption that because an item is older, that immediately means that it's scarce or that it has high monetary value. And that's not always the case. So again, we're talking about value. Think about your story that you want to share with others and think about what's important to you and your family. Next slide, please. So questioning use. Another thing that I really want to emphasize is that items are for use. So sometimes I talk with potential donors or folks that are trying to get their own personal and family archives in order, and they become very focused on trying to save something forever. So before you get to that point, I really want you to question why you're saving that item. Who are you saving it for? Again, what is its purpose? If you're saving it for a specific person or organization, if you're thinking of donating it, do they want that item? And we talked about sentimentality a little bit in the last slide, and that is so specific to every person. What's sentimental to one person might be very different to another. Oftentimes, the items that we use daily might be more sentimental than something that perhaps you spent a lot of money on or is a collectible item. I find that those items that tell their story through use, whether it's an object that gets used at a family celebration or a coffee cup or something that got used on a daily basis by a family member, and sometimes you really don't know. So I'm going to tell kind of an interesting story about this. So when my grandmother turned a certain age, she decided that she was going to sell her house and relocate. And during that process, we went through her items. We went through as a family and we hired a professional photographer to go through and take photos of the house. On the basement landing stairway, there was a pencil sharpener that was on the wall, and one of my uncles had a strong emotional attachment to that pencil sharpener because he had fond memories of going down the stairs every night and using that pencil sharpener for his homework. So we have a professional picture of that pencil sharpener. I would have never in a million years guessed that that would be a sentimental item for him. And I think that's why it's so important to continue that conversation with your family, with your friends. And again, thinking about those daily objects, because those are the objects that hold those memories, and you don't know what memories people are going to have with them. Thank you. Next slide. So on to preserving items. Next slide, please. So once you've kind of made those assessments for yourself and had those conversations with your family, let's talk about actually preserving the items. So the most important takeaway here is that preservation is an ongoing act. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between preservation, conservation, and restoration. So I think sometimes they get used a little bit interchangeably. So preservation is preventative. That's easy to remember. Preservation, preventative. It's about making sure that damage does not occur to an object. So you're thinking about what is the environment like in your house or the place that you're storing the objects. What can you do to prevent damage? Now that could be due to those extreme conditions, things like heat and humidity, or it could be due to the chemical composition of an object. That's called inherent vice, the inherent chemical qualities that make it degrade over time that you have no control over, and also things like safe handling practices. Conservation is more about when some sort of damage or decay has occurred and you need individual treatments on one object. So again, preservation, that's kind of looking more holistically at your items. Conservation, it's more about a specific item. So something has happened to that item and you want to do something to have that item become more usable. And lastly, restoration. Again, that's more at that sort of item level, individual treatments for an individual item, and it's about repairing an item back to its original condition. So restoration, you're maybe, again, kind of losing that story about use because it's not about getting something in an order where you could actually use it and not damage it further. It's about trying to make it look like the day it was created. So you tend to see that more with things like historic homes and cars, not so much with historic objects, but occasionally sometimes. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the individual things that might affect your historic items. So follow with me just a little bit on this. So I want you to imagine your items as a house guest. I know we're not having a lot of house guests right now, but imagine you're inviting a friend or family member over to be in your second bedroom or area of the house. They're going to stay with you for a couple of days. You'd want them to be comfortable, so you'd want them to have a manageable temperature and humidity level. You wouldn't want to put them in an area of the house that's leaking or has bugs or has exposure to car fumes, right? You would hopefully want your guests to be comfortable. So that's a good way to think about your items too. So I mentioned temperature and humidity. So things that can be potentially damaging to your items are things like really big temperature fluctuations. So think about those unfinished areas of your house, like those unfinished attics, like those crawl spaces, basements. I mentioned garages already. Those are going to have really big temperature fluctuations, and they probably have fluctuations in humidity too. Those big fluctuations or those extreme high or low temperatures can speed up that degradation process of materials. The same with light and sunlight. UV exposure is going to be more severe than other types of light, but in general, light is also very damaging to collections. Next, we have water. So again, that's kind of a little bit self-evident there, but having water or moisture could also invite other problems listed right after, such as pests and mold. So it's not just the water damage, but also what it is inviting. Pests are another consideration. I'll be talking a little bit more about individual types of objects a little bit later and how they react to some of these things. But again, depending on your objects, they could get eaten by pests. The same with mold. Certain types of items are very susceptible to mold. Smoke can be very damaging to items. So thinking about whether that's any kind of off-gassing from a car, or if you yourself smoke, or if you have a fireplace in your home, so keeping items away from any type of smoke. Things like dust. Dust can be very abrasive to objects. And then routine handling, so how you handle the objects. I realize that the last thing you want to hear right now is another person telling you to wash your hands. So I apologize, but I'm here to tell you to wash your hands. That's really the best thing that you can do for handling. Your hands and your face have natural oils in them, and those oils will transfer to those objects, which again is not great for the overall preservation. Next slide, please. So as you're thinking about preserving your items, anything that you should do to an object should be reversible. So let's take some paper documents as an example. If you have a stack of papers, doing something like repairing them with Scotch tape, that's next to impossible to reverse on your own, right? Once you've got the Scotch tape on that item, you can't really remove it yourself. So that's one thing to think about. Putting something in a folder, that's completely reversible. So folders are a good idea, but you shouldn't do anything that's, again, gonna have that permanent effect on it. Once again, I'm mentioning hand washing. That's partially for your objects and also partially for you. Again, as you're handling these things, they might be dusty or overall grimy, so you'll wanna wash your hands, and some of that dust and grime can then transfer to objects. There are a few key times where you might wanna wear gloves, and I'll get to that later. In general, when you're dealing with your objects, you should use a clean area free of food and drink as much as possible. I already mentioned avoiding using tape to repair, avoiding household cleaners. So even though it might be tempting to clean something with an object with something that you would clean in your home, it can actually be really damaging for your historic material. So I would say avoid using cleaners, and if there is any extensive damage, that's when you'd really want to go to a conservator. And as much as possible, you should try to store your objects in interior walls. So again, avoiding those places that have those extreme temperatures. So depending on the age of your house or what your insulation is like, you know, if you can touch the wall and it feels cold when it's cold outside, it's probably an exterior wall. So you want to think about more of those interior closets, interior spaces where there aren't those big temperature fluctuations. And you should try to keep things at least 3 inches off the ground as well. That'll keep things from getting bumped as you're walking around the house, or if you're doing, you know, your routine cleaning, like vacuuming and things like that. You don't want to bump into your stuff. And then if you don't have a choice and have to store in an area where maybe you've had, you know, an ant infestation or some water in the past, at least it's not directly on the floor. So I'd say that's my general advice for where to store objects. And I realize that space in your home is probably a commodity right now, but hopefully if you've been cleaning out some other areas, you have created some new space that you can prioritize and store some things that are of most value to you in these new spaces. Next slide, please. And lastly, for preserving items, you should really consider the condition and the composition of your items. So again, items that have more damage to them already, or items that you suspect could become more damaged in the future, those are really the ones that should be prioritized for storing in those more interior spaces. So this is sort of the least reactive to most reactive is how I've listed them. So let's talk about paper first and some of the concerns with paper. So the good thing about paper is that it's very long lasting. Paper has been created in a bunch of different ways over the years. We can talk more about paper acidity later if anyone's really interested. The bad thing about paper is that it's still susceptible to mold and bugs. So if you've ever had paper items that have little holes in them that you didn't put there, that's probably a sign that a bug was eating it, so being mindful of that. And that's where having things you know, stored in folders is really helpful because you're just creating that barrier. Books, similar to paper, but books are a little bit more complicated because they are bound. Books are also very susceptible to any changes in humidity, so their binding will actually expand and contract, and that's why sometimes you can see cracking. So again, taking those things into account. Clothing and textiles, again, they tend not to be too chemically reactive, but they are still susceptible to bugs and pests and things like that. And that's why, depending on what type of home you live in, maybe you're lucky enough to have a cedar closet, or you have like a cedar chest or something like that. Now we're getting into the list of things that are a little bit more reactive or a little bit more complicated to store. So photos. Photos are extremely susceptible to changes in temperature and humidity. So you might have already noticed this yourself, where you might have photos that are rolled, or they might be cracked in the emulsion. The emulsion is that shiny layer that's on a photo. You might have noticed you have photos from a couple decades ago where the dye is starting to fade and it looks like there's a weird tint in maybe a yellow or a blue, and you can't really figure out why. You don't remember the world being that blue then when you took the photo. Those are all signs of that sort of chemical deterioration. And other things related to photos. So not just the prints, but also the negatives are very reactive. The photo format that's probably the least stable are Polaroids. So one thing that I tell people is that if they have Polaroids, I actually recommend that they scan them or take a photo of them, just because they tend to degrade pretty quickly. Audiovisual items. These are something that I really encourage you, if you have them, to not throw them away, similar to the photos. Sometimes people will ask me about these outdated photo or AV items, and they'll say, oh, I don't have the player anymore, or nobody looks at slides anymore, so I'm going to throw out my slides away. I really urge you not to throw things out just based on format. It's very possible that there's hope for them yet. So slides in particular, I have a fondness for. Kodachrome slides are absolutely beautiful. If you have any in your possession, and they scan really beautifully. And there's quite a few audiovisual formats out there that even if you don't have the player anymore, there's plenty of vendors that still do, and there's still a way to salvage them. Those are less susceptible to things like pest and mold, but again, should not be exposed to water, and those temperature fluctuations are not great for them either. Art, if you have any art in your collection, thinking about framed versus unframed. Framed is kind of best because it's protecting the work as much as it is about displaying the work, but also working with someone who is knowledgeable about archival methods so that they're able to frame it in a way that is helpful and not hurtful for the artwork. Scrapbooks are interesting, and I'm going to assume we're going to have some spirited discussion about scrapbooks. They're such great resources, but they're also very tricky to preserve. So I don't think I've talked about newspapers yet. Newspapers can be incredibly acidic, and usually my advice for newspapers is not necessarily to keep an entire issue. Usually people keep a newspaper because there's a specific clipping that they want. So I encourage you to go ahead and make that clipping, and then perhaps even make a photocopy of it, just because those are highly acidic and will degrade over time. But with scrapbooks, the newspaper clippings or other things that were more ephemeral and not meant to last very long are often in there. So that's why scrapbooks can get a little bit challenging and a little bit tricky. And I would make those one of the top contenders if you have the space to store something in one of those more VIP areas of your home. 3D objects and furniture. Again, this is really going to vary by what the things are composed of. So again, that kind of common sense about thinking about that furniture, if it's composed of wood, if you have, wood furniture in your basement and you know that your basement floods, can you put something on casters? Are there things that you can easily move around? Things like that. And then I listed potentially hazardous items last. There are a couple different types of items to be aware of as you're going through your family collections. Things like taxidermy. If you have taxidermy in your possession, if you have old clocks that might have lead in them, if you have any firearms or weapons, anything, like I said, that you think might contain lead or that has been treated in a way that might be harmful to people. If you have things like that in your possession, I really encourage you to do that little bit of extra research and see if there's anything special that you need to do with them so that you're handling them in a way that's safe for you. Next slide, please. So next we're on to organizing and labeling. Next slide, please. So buying archival supplies. The main takeaway is that archival is not regulated or defined. So just because something says it's archival doesn't mean that it truly is. So things that you want to look out for are the photographic activity test designation for photos. You'll know it has it because it'll say it on there. They want to put that stamp on there. For paper and paper products like folders and boxes, you want to look for things that are acid-free or lignin-free. For safe archival plastics, you want things that are polyethylene, polypropylene, polyester, or mylar. And again, usually it'll be on the object, but sometimes you can contact the manufacturer directly if you're not sure. For writing utensils, a soft lead pencil or a designated PAT marker is best. And I usually recommend that people buy either directly from archival suppliers that I'll mention later or art supply stores because they tend to be the cheapest and the most reliable. Next slide, please. So whatever supplies I recommend for you are really going to depend on what you're trying to preserve. So again, in general, using a soft lead pencil is best. You don't want to apply too much pressure to objects. The same with the photo marker. There's a marker on the market called the IdentiPen. It's really only a couple of bucks and they sell them at a lot of art supply stores. They're great for glossy photos if you have more contemporary photos that are difficult to write on the back of. I don't recommend using pens or other markers. Those can be detrimental to the objects. And again, you might want acid-free boxes and folders in a variety of sizes depending on what you're trying to store. You might need some acid-free tissue paper if you're trying to store textiles or things of that nature. You might want some plastic binders if you're trying to replace out photo albums or things like that. If you're someone who is into scrapbooking, you might want to consider buying polyester mounts for mounting your scrapbooks and looking for scrapbook materials that once again are made from either those safe plastics or from acid-free, lignin-free paper. Safe plastic sleeves for photo and paper are also really important, so those safe plastics in the previous slides. I really encourage people to stay away from vinyl. Vinyl as a plastic, not vinyl as in, records, because it's very susceptible to those environmental changes, and it will shrink and it will warp and all sorts of gross things happen to it. So I really encourage you to stay away from vinyl containers. And lastly, I have gloves with an asterisk. So types of gloves that you might want are nitrile gloves. So they're same kind of examination gloves that you would find in a medical setting, or some kind of cotton glove, and those you can reuse and wash over and over again. There's not a whole lot of advantage to one over the other. The nitrile are disposable, but it's a little bit easier to use them because you have more dexterity with your fingers, but the cotton is nice because, again, you can use them over and over again. The one time that I do recommend that people use gloves, in addition to anything that you're concerned might be, again, a little bit dusty or gross, or you don't feel comfortable handling, is when you're handling photos and slides, because getting that fingerprint on there, it's very hard to remove. Next slide, please. And then as far as where you can buy some of these things, I kept these general recommendations pretty general, because I didn't want to recommend specific places too much, because there's quite a few places out there that will do these types of things. So again, if you have a certain type of store in this category that you frequent, it's very possible that they'll have some of these supplies available to you. If you would like to buy directly from an archival supplier, they would be very happy to have your business, and they will definitely ship directly to consumers, not just large organizations. And they're, again, usually very good about telling you the composition of the items. They usually run a lot of sales. So these are the two that I recommend the most. Next slide, please. And then finally, for organizing your items once you've decided what you're keeping and having your supplies. So the main thing to consider is about original order. So again, in working with potential donors or people who are trying to organize their collections, I think sometimes there could be an overemphasis on finding the one best way or the one and only way to organize things. And the truth of the matter is there's not one perfect solution or one perfect way to organize things. So again, we talked about that sort of use and how you're using items. Maintaining that original order can be important because it shows how you've used those items over time. So that's part of that story. How you organize your items is part of that story. So instead, I'd like to emphasize more knowing what you have, where it is, and what condition it is, over trying to continually organize and reorganizing the things. If you just get to that point where you know what you have, you know where it is, you know what condition it's in, and what kind of needs more help or more work, that's really huge. If you do decide to reorganize a little bit, it's really important to store like with like as best as you can. Obviously, if there's something like a scrapbook, you're going to have all sorts of materials intermingling and interacting with each other. But as much as you can, I would encourage you to store photos with photos, paper with paper, et cetera, et cetera. The important thing is just to follow your own logic in a way that clearly explains things to others. As you're doing this organizing, be sure to continue to check in with family and see what has value to them. As I mentioned previously, please keep those old formats. And finally, if you're going through your items, know that there's a way to work with vendors as well. Don't feel like you have to digitize everything yourself either. There are plenty of mail order services that will do that for you, where you can just put things in a box and ship them out to a place. So know that there's other solutions too. Next slide, please. So getting to the actual labeling of the items, I would encourage you to label what you can, but recognize that you won't be able to label everything. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about maintaining that original order. How you label things also tells a lot about your story and how you interact with the world. So I had one donor who came up with very creative names for his correspondence files. And one that stuck out to me was Reuben's Sandwich. So he was corresponding with someone named Reuben, and that's how he named his file. So I think that says a lot about his personality. And I don't want you to lose your personality or your family's personality in trying to label things. If I had to pick something for you to label, I'd most recommend your photos. Retain those unique nicknames, but definitely try to write out the more formal names too. Since you won't be able to label everything, I think it's okay to kind of cherry pick by role. So thinking about the rolls of film that you have, maybe just a couple of photos from each roll so that you at least have that baseline covered. It's really important to label on the back or on the corners of photos, or ideally both on the back and on the corner, so that you're writing away from people's faces. You're kind of writing on the areas that on the front of the photo would be more of the background, if that makes any sense. Be sure that you write lightly, because that pressure can be damaging to objects as well. And then you always want to avoid sticky notes, labels, tape, and as much as you can, metal fasteners, but more so those first three. So sticky notes fall off over time, which is problematic because then you've lost that information. If they get stuck to something they shouldn't, they can damage the photo. So if somehow it gets unstuck from the back of a photo and restuck to the front of a photo, it will start, ripping that photo layer off. Labels, kind of same as sticky notes. Tape, again, very hard to reverse over time, and I have seen it peel off or come off and then you lose that information. And then metal fasteners, if you're able to avoid them, I recommend it. Over time, they can actually rust and be very damaging to paper. Next slide, please. So now that you've gone through your objects and you've organized them and labeled them, we can get into sharing. Next slide, please. So with digital objects, know that digital doesn't necessarily last forever. Just because you scan something or put it online doesn't mean that it'll be there for posterity. Of course, it's so much easier now for us to create objects digitally than in the past with increased, storage capabilities and things like that. So my main thing for you to remember is to check those items on a regular basis and move them to a new format as you can. And always go through your newest technology first. So if you have a computer that still has a CD drive or still has USB ports, go through those items first while you still have that technology available. A lot of these different types of technologies, like CDs or like flash drives, they're not meant for long term. They're really just meant to share immediately. So if something is about sharing, don't assume that it's there for preservation as well. Next slide, please. So what you can do to manage your digital items going forward is to start good data steward practices. So you may want to consider a cloud-based backup system. So rather than storing things, like I said, on those CDs, on those thumb drives, that's great for one-time sharing. But if you're thinking about keeping things around indefinitely, I really recommend using some kind of cloud-based backup. It's less time, effort, and energy on your end because you don't have to keep up with it. You're kind of outsourcing that responsibility to someone else. Make sure you're managing your passwords and keeping track of your accounts and where you're saving things. There's a lot of different, file sharing and photo sharing services nowadays, and they often like to change their terms of service, and maybe they allow so many photos for free and then you have to pay. So it's really important to keep track of where all those things are. Also make sure that you're using widely supported software formats and file extensions. Things that are the most well-known and the most widely used are going to be the easiest to preserve and move forward over time. Establish file name protocols that make sense to you and adhere to them. So a lot of times when we take these new photos on our phones, they give us these very odd, automatically generated names. That's not helpful when you're trying to go through and find your own photos and things like that. So I recommend that as you're able to kind of go back and create a file name protocol that makes sense for you. So that could be things that might include the date, maybe the name of someone in there or an event, something of that nature. Always make sure that you're using widely accepted characters and don't put in spaces or odd characters like exclamation points. So I would say usually dashes and underscores are okay, but I try to stay away from other ones. And then the last piece of advice for this is to go through items at least annually. So again, maybe kind of do that annual checkup, see what photo services you're still subscribed to, where are you still sharing things? Are those the only places that they're shared? Are there digital photos and other objects that you'd like to get rid of? Some good ways to remember this might be tying it to an annual event like tax season, if you're going through a lot of your items anyway, or it could be leading up to some kind of big family event. So if you have an annual family anniversary or family get together, to kind of tie it to that, because then you can share some of your results. Next slide, please. And then sharing items with family and friends. So once again, please remember that access is not the same as preservation. You might want to think of what's going to happen to your online accounts and how you would like them to be managed over time. It's okay to have multiple ways to provide access if you have things shared one way, and then you're also creating photo albums on your favorite social media. That's fine, just don't rely on that social media to save those things forever. And always try to use what you have first before you go out and buy a bunch of fancy equipment. If you have a scanner at home or something like that, that will probably serve you fine. And also consider that cost of effort. Again, I kind of talked about slides earlier. If you only have a handful of slides, it might make sense to just use that scanner. But if you have a ton of slides, then it might make sense to invest in something like a specific slide scanner so you can go through them more quickly. And lastly, it's always okay to print copies of things for posterity. If it's too much, if you would prefer to print something rather than manage the digital, know that that's always an option, and there are still plenty of vendors out there who will print photos for you. Next slide, please. So lastly, after you've gone through your things, you've kind of assessed your digital life a little bit too, let's talk about disposing of unwanted items. So I'd also like you to consider the life cycle of your items. So we talked about the degradation of materials a little bit and how they decompose over time. That can be problematic if you're trying to keep things, but it can also be problematic if you're trying to get rid of things. So everyone's local recycling practices are a little bit different. So I've linked out to this website that goes a little bit more into recycling symbols and also what's available in different municipalities. It's always easier to try to recycle something earlier in its life cycle. So again, if you have these plastics, if you have these papers, they'll eventually reach a point where they can't be reused or recycled again. So if you're kind of going through things on a regular basis, it's easier just to recycle them earlier on. Know that there are municipalities that will do paper shredding on an annual basis. Sometimes at banks or community centers. If you're going through clothing, there are a lot of places who do give back bags. So if you're buying things online, you can do things in that way. There's recycling for just about every type of object out there. And even in these times where we're encouraged not to go and just sort of dump off items at a charity shop, there's still quite a few places that, again, will accept things by mail, so you can mail things in, or doing pickup type situations. So I just kind of gave some general ideas to give you a little bit of inspiration if you are looking to dispose of some of your items. Next slide, please. And lastly, I just wanted to share some favorite resources with you. So again, these all link out, so I won't go over them too much, but we have a conservator resource. We have some different items for learning about copyright, more appraisal. There's personal archiving from Library of Congress that has a lot of great individual archives information. Next slide, please. And then this is just part 2 of that. So the National Park Service and the NEDCC both have these really great leaflets that are only 1 or 2 pages long, that if you want specific information on one type of thing, it's very readable. It's only 1 or 2 pages. And then of course, there's the general link to the Society of American Archivists. I also encourage you to potentially reach out to local genealogy groups or your local public library. Even in these times, people are still meeting virtually, and there are plenty of reference librarians that might be able to help you if you are researching your family in more normal times when these facilities are open to the public. There are often services where you can use the library scanner or things like that. So you might want to do that research now to see what other technology is available for you. And lastly, this book, Creating Family Archives, a step-by-step guide to saving your memories for future generations by Margot Note, is very highly recommended. So if you found this talk helpful, you will find her book even more helpful. So I really highly recommend that as well. It's available at quite a few booksellers out there, so your bookseller of choice. All right, I'm a little bit over time, so thank you very much for your time and attention, and I think we're going to look at some of the questions you left in the chat. Thank you.
All right, I'll go from the top. The first one was, do you collect pop culture items like old Nancy Drew books, Girl Scout manuals, and uniforms?
In general, the WLA collects more of those personal papers as opposed to pop culture. You did pique my interest a little bit with the Girl Scout uniforms. Again, if there's something that's kind of telling that story of someone's life, there could be something there. So you can still feel free to reach out to me with some of those specific items. And if you'd like for them to perhaps go somewhere else, I can try to direct that and put you in contact with an archivist who might be interested in some of those items. Thank you.
The next question is how to repair old photos and recipes.
Oh, interesting. So I will say it's a little bit hard to do your own paper or photograph repair. So normally what I would recommend is looking over that list of safe plastics that I had in there and trying to find some kind of sleeve that you could put that recipe or that photo into. So it's in that sleeve, it's not going to get damaged further, it's not going to fall apart, and they're not going to get lost as 2 separate pieces. So that would be my recommendation. If you want something that's a little bit more usable, you could always try to scan those things in and Photoshop them. And there are definitely photo restoration services that exist where you can scan in a photo and they will do that photoshopping for you. Thank you.
The next one's about preserving slides. What's the best equipment and brand I should use to preserve slides? And is there a best digital format to store the slide images?
Yes, for preserving slides, so I'll kind of give the whole overview. So for labeling slides, if you're going to label them, if it's something where it's on paper, you could probably get away with writing, softly on the paper like we discussed. As far as what to store them in, you have a couple of different options. You could look for an archival box that is meant specifically for slides. So they make these long rectangular boxes that are the dimensions of slides, and you can store things in there. They take up a lot less space than having a slide carousel. So I actually recommend for people not to store things in the slide carousel long term, because there can, get dust and other things in there. It's hard to take things out and they can potentially get damaged. The other way to store things is, again, one of those safe plastic enclosures. So they'll make these slide sleeves that are, the size of a piece of notebook paper. And those are nice because then you don't necessarily have to write directly on the slide. They usually have some kind of like tab on there so that you can write for each individual slide a little bit of info, or you can write at the top about the entire page. I don't have specific recommendations for slide scanners. You do have a couple of options. You can do something like you can use your scanner at home if you have one already, just a regular flatbed scanner, and scan things that way. You can scan multiple slides at once. If you feel comfortable and proficient with Photoshop, you can just hit scan once and then go in and sort of edit out each of the slides. And then they do make those automatic scan sliders that I was recommending before. With any type of technology, that all changes so quickly that what I usually recommend for people is just to go and check all those recommendations. So, looking on some of your favorite tech websites and looking for those recommendations, checking things like consumer reports, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. That answers a few more questions about the slides. So I'm going to skip over a few more to get to a question I'm now curious about. Is it necessary to retain photo negatives?
That is a great question, and I'm so glad that someone asked it. So there's sort of a great debate about that. And I'll tell you kind of both sides of the debate. So the people who advocate for keeping them, the rationale is that you have your print photos, and if something happens to your print photos, you would go back to the negative and you would make a new print. However, nowadays, I don't know how likely people are to do that. Do you go back to the negative? How do you store your negatives? How do you label them that you even kind of could go back and make sure? But for some people, they want that sense of security to have those. So I leave it to your discretion. Like I said, I feel like there's an argument either way of, I might go back to this if I need a reprint, or no, I'll just accept that I won't be able to match things up, or we have enough technology now that I could scan something back in and try to fix it digitally.
The next one is, what vendors in Chicago are reliable?
That's another great question. So within the resources, I linked out to, sorry, I printed my slides and now I'm kind of going back through, but there is a conservation resource where you can search. It's called the AIC Find a Conservator tool through culturalheritage.org. So you can actually search by zip code. And I really recommend resources like that that are a composite, because then you can search by zip code and you can search by type of thing, and then they will list out speciality. Sometimes even just calling or emailing that vendor themselves and asking them about their practices. Now that you're an informed consumer and have all this new information about what's archivally okay and what's not okay, you can ask those type of questions first. While I'm hesitant to usually give specific recommendations, I will say that in the Chicago area, both here in this career position and in previous positions, I've used the Conservation Center, previously known as the Chicago Conservation Center, and they work with individuals as well as professional archives.
Awesome. What's the best current storage for digital images, if you had a recommendation?
So I'll lump part of this answer with a previous one because there was I think in part of the questions about slide, I might have skipped over about file format. So file format for scanning things in. I recommend things like either JPEG or TIFF. Again, it's thinking about those file formats that are recognizable to you and are likely to be used in the future. So if you're talking about file types for photos, I would say, JPEG or TIFF, using things in the kind of Microsoft Office or PDF, those types of formats that are likely to be supported over a long period of time. As far as the actual storage, that's another one of those kind of hyper-personal decisions, and it depends on your needs. It might depend on what type of computer you have. So if you have a Mac versus a PC, it could depend on the size of your items, like how many terabytes you have. So for the most up-to-date information, I really recommend going to places like PC World. So all of those different kind of tech-related magazines, they usually have up-to-date reviews, things like Consumer Reports. So any other place that you would go as a consumer to kind of make those informed decisions about a product, those are going to have the most up-to-date information for you.
Great. We don't have a ton of time, so I think this is going to be our last question. A few questions were actually answered in the chat, so there's a lot of great resources. I think everyone has different knowledge, but wanted to get to this question. What is a good practice for communicating what's kept where for other family members?
Oh, that's a really good one too. I think you could even just keep a list of things as well. So just to let people know, as you're kind of doing that annual review, just like how you would review for your taxes as you're going through, whenever you're reviewing other important paperwork. If you have some kind of box in your house, I know some people might have a safe or a fireproof box where they keep important documents. Maybe in that type of box, you put in a piece of paper that's just a one sheet of all the different locations of those kind of sentimental items, or if you have a lockbox in a bank, just to put things in there too, to know that that list is only accessible to the people closest to you.
Great. We just have a few minutes before 3 o'clock, so I wanted to say thank you and hand it over to Gabrielle to wrap us up and check off the box of another great event. I just want to thank everyone for spending some time with us, but I'm gonna hand it over to Gabrielle.
Thank you. Thank you, Jory. Thank you so much, Emily. This has been a terrific program. For attendees, please remember that we have recorded the program and we'll be sending out the slides shortly, along with a request for ideas for future programs. Our next